We come now then to this sort of fundamental question of what exactly is animation. We've seen some of the answers in the previous videos. We've talked about the basic principles of animation. We've looked at how, forces influence motion. We've seen, basic body mechanics, little bits and pieces like that. And really, most of this is sort of the technical detail of animation. It's, a lot of the detail that goes into animation work. It's some of the building blocks that we use to construct animation from. However, animation really is, or a good animation at least, is much more than just the sum of these parts. Animation is art. It is artistry. Personally, I would describe it as a performance art. It sits alongside things like acting and dance. It is a way of using movement, it is a way of using body language, it is a way of using facial expression to communicate a narrative, a story, a meaning or a journey. To that extent, this tutorial series needs to do something a little different than the other series that you will have seen. For instance, if you've seen my, rigging tutorials or nodal or GI or whatnot, then those are very much about following a process. You click this button, you connect that thing, and you get this exact outcome. Now, the same is true, of course, in a way of animation. Take some rig and get this part and pose it here on exactly this frame and then somewhere else on exactly this other frame, and copy it like this keyframe for keyframe, and you will get the exact same outcome, clearly. However, of course, much like using reference, doing that is of little use, as it doesn't teach you to create your own animation. It doesn't teach you to express things yourself artistically. Although there are techniques and workflows and principles that apply to building an animation, every single animation and every single character is a complete individual. Thus, just learning some paint-by-number approach to producing animation really isn't going to help an awful lot. So whilst in this series we will see plenty on, the various tools that we can use and techniques that can be applied to make a certain thing animate in a certain way, or to, take a rig and transition it from one pose to another pose in a nice way and see how we structure in-betweens and all of that. There is this other section, this performance art section, that is much more difficult to teach in a formal way. In a great many ways, in fact, it's something that you're just going to have to discover for yourself, and you'll do that by trying, by practicing, by doing things over and over again, and most of all, by developing a critical eye for your own work, as well as indeed the work of others, so that you can compare. You can learn to see where you're going wrong, where others are going right, or vice versa. To this end, one of the, most important factors to sort of consider and keep your eye open for is quality. The quality of the animation, which very often, very, very often, is synonymous with the principle of appeal. How appealing is your animation? How well does it, connect and communicate with the viewer? It is entirely possible to have a technically perfect piece of animation, but which is dull and boring and doesn't really say anything. Likewise, it's also possible to create a very appealing, very, connective piece of animation with a few flaws and problems inside of it, but which the audience will not see. They will automatically overlook because they are more connected with what is actually happening on screen than all of the little details going on. One thing I've often heard said, of course, amongst the community of jobbing animators or aspiring animators is that, we don't all have to produce work on the level of, Pixar or DreamWorks. A lot of us who do this for a living, we're not producing, works of great art for multi-million-dollar, productions. We're doing insurance commercials and run cycles for video games. Simpler little things like this. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't have to be, this great work of art every time you sit down to animate something. It just has to, serve its purpose, of course. But I personally believe that if you don't aspire, if you do not dream of being able to create a work of beauty, that your work, all of your work, will suffer because of it. of all the artists I know, irrespective of their discipline, sculpture, music, whatever else, there is a great array of, skill and talent available within these people. They all, no matter how good or how bad, aspire to, produce some great work of beauty at least once in their lives. And those few I've met who don't, who are, quite satisfied to just produce some, mediocre work, which is more or less passable, are forever stuck in the rut of only ever just producing banal, mediocre, trite garbage, quite frankly. So what do we do, with such ideas? How do we put any of it into practice? Well, one of the main things, as I say, is developing the critical eye. You have to be able to spot good work from bad. And you can do this with any kind of art. For instance, here's some portrait drawings that we look up on Google. And we can find, a good number that are really well done. They display excellent, truly, excellent levels of artistic skill. Some of them are really quite beautifully rendered, if perhaps a little pastiche from time to time. But with a little bit of a browse, and seemingly Google likes to put up the good stuff, there should be some not so good stuff available here and there. Now, there's one. Look at this. Robert Downey Jr. That's, it displays a certain level of skill, certainly, but it's also kind of ugly. Look at this eye. This eye is bigger than that one. It's not quite right. There's something wrong. And look at this. Look at this. Look at that. Who's that? That's Rihanna. My God, that's awful. I can barely even describe how poor a drawing that really is. In truth, it's about the same level of competency with a pencil that I myself possess. Doesn't mean I don't wish I could draw like this, however. I wonder if we've got any other great examples here. This is interesting, obviously highly stylized. It certainly lacks the detail and, realism of some of these other works that we can display. But does it lack finesse? Does it lack beauty? Does it lack artistry? I don't think it does. For all its crazy strokes, it's striking. It communicates something. Have we any more? Any more? Oh yes, I believe that's meant to be Emma Watson. Yes, it is meant to be Emma Watson. Not very good at all. In a way, it's technically sort of okay. The lines and the shapes are broadly correct, but it's just ugly, plain ugly. There's no appeal. That's what's missing. What can I say? There is good art and there is bad art. However, what's incredibly important to realise is that bad art isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, I imagine that some of those who've churned out some of the really quite exquisite work that we can see here, once upon a time churned out really bad work. And that, I'm afraid, is just part of the journey. You will produce far more bad animation before you start producing good animation, unless you just happen to be, supernaturally gifted for it. So what about animation itself? Well, some of it should be obviously wrong and bad. So bad that it's you almost can't call it animation, other than the fact that something is moving. That's about, as far as it gets towards that definition. Other stuff can be a bit harder. This is a good attempt at some sort of character being injected into a walk cycle here, but it's it's very wooden, it's very robotic. There's not a lot of softness to the motion. It makes it look just too rigid. This piece is interesting. It's got a good few technical flaws. Look at the arm drifting there. Look, drift, and look now. See, drift and drift and all of that going on. It's got a number of technical flaws to it, but it's making some strong poses along the way. A couple of the facial expressions are actually quite good. It's starting to get appeal, and you sort of start to overlook the problems with it somewhat. You have to watch it a couple of times before you really start to clock on and they start to stand out, because you are getting this strength to the body language, to the appeal of the piece. And so the technical flaws, the drifts and all of that, you know, that's something that can be fixed. I mean, very clearly this piece here is the result of pose-to-pose animation. The animator has, you know, put in these key poses and tried to animate the transitions and holds between them, and it's all gone a bit wrong. But that technical stuff, that can be fixed. That can be fixed relatively easily with just a bit of, you know, time and work and practice. But the appeal is definitely starting to show through. There's a similar thing here. Really nice little appealing bit of animation. Some of it, again, it's very sharp. You know, the transitions one pose to the next is very sharp. There's not a lot of time in the transitions, and you sort of get these little frozen instants. It's sort of like a bunch of these frozen instants clutched together. But you're certainly getting a feel of this character, you know, what he's thinking, what he's doing. You can really read on his face, you know, the little collect and excitement. I mean, you know, it really starts to come out. So we're getting a good deal of appeal here, even if, again, you know, there are technical errors where certain things could be improved. Of course, we get other things where there's plenty of motion and whatnot going on, but it's really terribly unappealing. Lots of technical problems with it, you know, it's very slow, it's very floaty. It's not really containing itself well, but mainly it's just lacking appeal. It doesn't communicate very well. A lot of it is also motion for the sake of motion. Why are these arms flapping around? What's you know, going on? What's the point? In a lot of these moves, it's you know, it's sort of trying to do too much in a way, and that's detracting from the real point of it. But then, of course, you see some really good stuff like, you know, this guy here. I mean, look at that, really flicking about, you know, all over the place. Look, it's got real spring. The holds are nice and soft. It's got this thing that we call stillness in motion during his holds. He doesn't stop dead. You know, look at that. There's something going on. There's just a tiny little move on the arms or a look around of the eyes. Stillness in motion is something that screen actors, you know, work on a lot, so as they don't just appear to die when they're sat there motionless. And look, it really flows. It's got this real, you know, sort of bounce. Got all of these little details like that. That's lovely. That little sort of slowdown in midair, totally unrealistic, but it plays beautifully into the whole, you know, sense of the thing as he's come leaping in off the screen there. You know, you get this really nice sense of posing, of motion, of the transitions between them. You know, it's soft, it's appealing. You can really sense, you know, the character's sort of motives and his mood. Look at that at the end. It's wonderful. Lovely, lovely stuff. As I say, you know, not everything has to be some great, perfect work, and I can assure you that, you know, doing animation for people over the years, it has not always been. Here's one little thing that I did some number of years ago. It's pretty bad in a lot of ways. Mainly you can very much tell, especially here on this guy, look, it's clearly pose-to-pose animation. There's really just bad transitions, really sort of lifeless in certain parts. Forget that this character over here in the yellow shirt is quite an ugly little fella. You know, there's an awful lot of it just sort of moves and stops and moves and stops and moves and stops. You know, I've sketched this out pose to pose, and I really haven't been able to do an awful lot with the transitions to create the kind of, you know, flow and appeal to the motion as a whole. A little simple thing here from some piece again years ago. Not a lot going on, not a great amount of action, but look at the little dink with the pencil there at the end. I mean, yeah, you could say this tap, could it be better? Yeah, sure, it could be. But that lovely little squeak drop just gives a great little extra sense of, you know, character in there with what is essentially a very simple, you know, non-active piece of animation. It's finding an opportunity to try and insert something there. So even though it's not a particularly great piece or even necessarily that good a piece by a normal standard, somehow I did manage to find an opportunity to squeeze in something, you know, cute and funny and whatnot. This is another clip actually from the same project with a number of characters, and you can see, you know, it's sort of a bit alive here again. It's got a lot of, especially that earlier part, where they're all just standing around, there's not a lot happening. The stillness in motion thing isn't really very, very well done. But it's sort of middling, mediocre sort of stuff. But of course, this is, as I say, not everything has to be, Pixar. And of course, most of this stuff is done, to a time and a budget. So of course, one of the things that you will encounter an awful lot when you do this for a living is that you just don't have the time to put in all of the work that's necessary to create something that's better. So getting something that serves its purpose and fits the bill, is often good enough. As I say, there's a lot of technical errors with this. Elements of the, the smoothness and the flow of the animation are really what's missing. It's very, it's very wooden in a way. However, if you watch the characters and their expressions and how they point around at one another, it really does illustrate what's going on in the shot, and that's really the more important part to be able to get right in such a piece. And if you want to see something truly bad, this is from a number of years ago. I had a total of 3 days to model this and rig and animate and render and everything else. 3 days total, and it's just so bad. It's so bad. I mean, look at that. It's just wooden, awful. Oh God, it's just awful. Really awful. I'm so ashamed. So ashamed. So ashamed. But there you go. We all have to produce rubbish sometimes. And so I'll leave you last of all with this little piece that I knocked up as a quick example. I timed myself on this. This took me a total of 12 minutes to produce from beginning to end. And it's really not very good. In a way, it almost seems good. It's got no bad clicks or, jumpy motions or, misbehaviours on the rig. It's reasonably smooth. It's not robotic and so on. But it's really done to demonstrate some of the major holes that animators, especially, newer, less experienced animators, will find themselves falling into. First of all, too much movement. Why is he constantly moving? He doesn't stay still, not once. There's always something on the go, right? This is one of the things that when you are starting with animation, I can tell you this from experience, that's really hard to get out of your head. You have your character doing stuff and you need them to sort of stop or hold for a few seconds for whatever reason. And they sort of seem to die, and you have this urge to just try and add in movement, keep things moving all the time. And that's not always a good thing. You can actually have too much movement, and you will at times need to resist this urge to actually have your character or animated whatever actually moving. Sometimes you do need just to slow it down, By all means have a little bit of movement, but very small, very subtle. This really here, it's just overplayed. It's just too much. And what's the point? Why is he, flipping about left, right, forward, backwards, all over the place? What is it? What's he communicating? I say nothing. So there you go. There's that. It also leads us into this idea of appeal. Is this animation particularly appealing? I don't really think so. I mean, technically, as I say, it's good. You've got, overlap and follow through and slow in, slow out and everything else going on, but it's not really grabbing my attention in any way, other than the fact that, he's just gesticulating wildly and he's sort of hard to ignore because he's just flying around in your face. But that's not the same thing as appeal. It's really not. And the other thing that this demonstrates, which is a common thing that folk will do, is the fact that you see both of his arms are sort of going along with one another. It's not the fact that they're, perfectly in sync or that their poses are, in perfect symmetry to one another. It's just the fact that they are copying one another. This is something that's called twinning. And very often when you see it in animations, it is a sign that the animator is sort of lost for ideas. They've thought of something to do with one hand and they can't think of something to do with the other, and so they wind up twinning between the two. And I mean, just watch yourself, the way that you move or the way that other people do when they're doing stuff or when they're talking, having a conversation. Look for how often their arms will actually twin with one another. Every now and then they'll do it, but most of the time they don't. It's much more common to have asymmetrical posing and action across your body. But in spite of that, this is, a trap that is very easy to fall into. Also, just to divert back again to the work of others, here's a fascinating example, I think, which shows about, how you sort of have to fit things within the constraints of your budget and whatnot, and how certain errors don't really matter from the perspective of the audience. We say about not everything has to be Pixar or DreamWorks, but you'll find that even people like Pixar and DreamWorks will, scoot over things from time to time. This, of course, is, a clip from Shrek, and it's the bit where Shrek and Donkey meet one another. And what I want you to watch is the knights in this one shot just coming up any second now, which is when Shrek comes up and sort of challenges them, which is here. Watch this guy. Look. Step, step. Let me just cue it exactly. It's right about here. Come on. And watch this guy, this knight here. Okay. I'm just sort of winging around, who's over the F guy's shoulder here, and just watch his step. Watch as he takes a step back and he goes step, step, slide. Look at that, sliding feet. He just slides completely. Oops, slide. See it again, and step, step, slide. Look at that. It's terrible. It's absolutely abysmal piece of animation, that little slow out that he does there. Look at that. You can see the IK just reaching for that spear on the arm as the spear stays still and the rest of him moves back. I mean, it's truly awful, but you never ever notice it, or rather it's the sort of thing that only another animator would ever notice. It's a background character, it's just sort of making a bit of, it's eating up a bit of visual space. The attention of the audience, it's here, and of course it's on Shrek himself in the foreground here. What these other guys are doing, you don't really pay attention to, so you can get away with some bad stuff and it's still okay. So there we go, a sort of an attempt at making a roundup of animation as an art. Of course, the difficulties that poses us and so on. The last thing I want to leave you with, though, is this idea that it is not doom and gloom. You will produce rubbish work. God knows I have produced rubbish work. I've shown you some of it. And it is truly, truly just embarrassing and shameful. But that is the route to eventually producing better work. Certainly, if you're starting out in animation, following these tutorials, I guarantee you are in for, a good road ahead before you will be able to start producing better work. That's fine. Don't be disheartened. Don't let a few failures put you off. I once read an interview in Wired magazine with John Lasseter where he said you have to respect failure, because failure is just the negative space that surrounds success. So please, be patient, keep trying, keep practicing, keep working, keep aspiring, and keep dreaming above all else.